We're using diffusion MRI to do that. The way we use that is the basic way of diffusion MRI to use magnetic field gradients. The key thing is that, for example, if you have a fiber like that is made of axons in blue, you have this myelin sheath in sky blue, let's say, the astrocyte, oligodendrocytes, and glial cells. That's a very pictorial vision of an axon, but why not? Of an axonal bundle. If you use this and you use magnetic field gradients, the effect it will have will be to create a slope in the strength of the local magnetic field. And then when you use this resonance in the MRI acquisition, then you're going to have different local magnetic fields, so different persisting rates. And then you, obviously, for one excitation in your MRI image, you're going to find signal decay because some spins are not seeing the same magnetic fields as other. It's just that in that case, you know exactly what's the slope you put in there because it's the gradient. So you can assess in which direction is this signal decay occurring more than in other directions. And then you can say, oh, my water has been diffusing during my acquisition. It has been changing magnetic field locally, and then it's not fully coherent with itself and it loses coherence. So you have a signal decay. It gives an image that looks like crap, honestly, compared to a T1 image, because it has other limitations on the hardware that makes it like bigger, coarser resolution. So it's not as pretty. And also you can see that the signal decay, you can still guess the ventricles of the brain. Obviously, these ones will lose a lot of signal because water is very free to diffuse. And in that case, it will lose its coherence very fast on very short times. And in other parts of the brain, it's a bit harder to guess what's going on, at least in that image. But this image contains a lot of information. And that's why you lose a lot of signal also. And then that's the kind of image that will give you a tractography image, or a tractogram. That's also a name for it. Compared to a T1 that cannot give you this. So that's the point of diffusion MRI in that specific field, to use this information. Then tractography, just to make it work in practice, you need to be able to isolate this part of the diffusion orientation information. How do you tease apart this, like just the orientation information from this entire data set? And there are many people that worked on this. I'm just putting the main ones here. And for example, you could extract information on different, with different shapes. So you could extract peaks. So a peak is just the main direction along which diffusion is occurring. This can be obtained in different ways. I'll talk about this afterward. But that's one way to represent this information, just a single peak. And here, in that case, you have a three-way crossing of three fibers. You could use a peak and add some cones to it. So you can say, okay, I have this peak, but I will have some uncertainty on this orientation, and I will draw a cone. Most of the time, these cones are of equal aperture, which is maybe not the best way of handling it, but it is easier to compute. So that's why people are doing it. And also, it's hard to have very fiber-specific information on this uncertainty. And the last one is this orientation distribution functions, ODFs, which are literally a probability distribution of how orientations are represented in that voxel. That is literally what they are. And this one, it gives a pretty, like a larger picture of what's going on. So you can see that maybe the vertical fiber has some more uncertainty in some direction. It could happen because biology is very complex compared to the objects I'm showing here. So anything is kind of open bar at that point. So then once you isolated this information, you can have different tracking strategies, I would call them. One of these strategies is local tracking. So local tracking is trying to find a path across a few voxels. So this path may be deterministic or it may be probabilistic. For example, let's say I have some peaks in there, so they kind of go in that direction. So you have one peak like this, one peak like that, and one peak pretty much like that. And then you use a deterministic tracking algorithm. It will use some criterion, doesn't matter, some criterion to kind of say, I will connect these peaks together and create a fiber-ish streamline. So for example, that would be this one. And for a deterministic algorithm, this is the only one you can ever get. And that's it, because it is deterministic. Once you're on one path, you will not change it. You cannot go some other path. And then if you want to change the criterion for cryptography, then you may change the path, but that's deterministic. So it's one way to go and that's it. A probabilistic algorithm may start with the very same configuration here, but give different outputs at the end, because every time it goes from one voxel to another, you're going to have some probability sampling to go in one direction or another. So actually this one could be obtained, but maybe this one could be obtained, and maybe this one could be obtained, even though you started with the same configuration here. So it seems like probabilistic is exploring more options, which is a good thing, and could also be a bad thing if you explore too many other options, and some of them are bad, because it's hard to maybe tease apart good and bad options. You have also other kinds of strategies for tracking that are not local, for example. It could be local or not local, it doesn't really matter, but global tracking is one way to do that. And actually we'll try to optimize the entire connectome, let's say, at once, the entire set of connections at once. Compared to local tracking that will try to optimize it very locally at the voxel level, global will do it on the broader level. So the problem is that this is more computationally expensive most of the time, but it is one way to do it. It is quite recent, I'll show you afterwards. And machine learning obviously is one good thing to try at tracking. And there are actually people already doing this. And yeah, it shows some results. It's always hard to say validate cryptography. It's hard to have a ground truth behind it to validate it, but we have some phantoms and stuff like this that we can use. And there are other ones that I'm not talking about, other kind of tracking strategies. Just to give you some timeline about this, the deterministic local tracking is one of the most famous one in terms of numbers of papers, and it started very early, like 1999, so pretty much like 20 years ago. And then he went to different options and different strategies across the time, and this is just 5 papers. There are many more. I'm just 5 of the main ones. Probabilistic is more recent, is 2007-ish and further. Again, these are the main ones, but you can see that there are less of these papers anyway. Like I just chose 2, and there are 5 important ones in the other category. There's also this paper that is pretty good because it's comparing both in terms of connectomics, which one seems to be better. In appearance, it seems that deterministic tracking is a bit more efficient at this kind of stuff. But again, probabilistic is quite young as a field, so maybe not. This global tracking, it's even more recent, 2011 and further. And machine learning, you can find some very recent papers on this. Again, just the main ones. But it is a very young field in general, I would say. So now let's go back to this fiber, there's these ways to represent the orientation information. And then let's try to see how people obtain this information as of now. Like what's the current way to get access to these ways to represent orientation? So there are 2 main ways used right now. The first is diffusion tensor imaging, DTI, I will explain it. And the other one is called constrained spherical deconvolution, or CSD. I will demonstrate how they kind of work. I will try it with pictures and no math, so bear with me. Starting with the same voxel. And the same voxel here contains 3 of these fibers crossing together. And when you do DTI, you're going to obtain pretty much 1 peak for this entire voxel. Even though there are 3 fibers, doesn't matter, you're going to obtain 1 peak. And then the way diffusion tensor imaging works is that it's going to take the entire diffusion profile of that initial voxel and consider the average of it. So you're going to try to fit pretty much 1 exponential in this with 1 diffusion tensor representing the average of this. And this, you're going to isolate the main orientation of that diffusion tensor, assuming, for example, it is axisymmetric. But even though you can always take the axis with the largest eigenvalue, it's going to take you this direction. And this is the peak you're going to get. That's it, done. The other one, CSD, is going to do something slightly different. In the end, you're going to get this ODF, which is a more complex objects, obviously, and that kind of shows you that you have actually a three-way crossing in there. And the way it works is that it's going to take one fiber. So for example, in the corpus callosum, you have a single fiber bundle at the middle of the corpus callosum. So then you're going to try to aim at this region, and you're going to try to estimate a certain diffusion tensor to represent a fiber. This one is going to be like, we usually call it a response function, because it also tells you how the signal decays when it encounters the fibers at a certain angle, a certain b value, and so on and so forth. But like the key thing is trying to fit one fiber response, one fiber tensor. And then you're going to assume that all fibers are pretty much the same in the brain. And then you're going to try to fit how many of these, and they really look like baguettes now that I see that, but like you try to see how many of these tensors you can fit at different orientations and with which weight. And then if you do that in a complex way enough, you're going to get these ODF functions. Just to be a bit clearer, usually you try to choose a basis of functions to do that, like spherical harmonics, and then you try to combine them. So spherical harmonics of these baguette-like tensors. And then you get the ODF. ODF, obviously, you can also get this kind of peak thing by just taking the local maxima of the ODF. So in that case, you would get 3 peaks, actually. So it is one way to get the exact same thing you have here on the top, is to just take this complex object and like dumb it down to 3 peaks. For the cones, they are always added artificially. So you have ways, for example, to do tractography using a specific cone angle, and then you can do the same tractography with a sharper or with a coarser like cone angle. And then you can try to combine all of these tracks that you obtain and then filter out some bad ones. They are starting to have pretty efficient algorithms to filter out tracks that don't make sense with regards to some prior information. So it is one way, but keep in mind that this cone is very artificial. These ones are more natural to some extent when it comes to representing information. So now when we try this, we try DTI tractography and we try CSD in the cortical spinal tract. So CSD is a constrained spherical deconvolution. You can see that one gives you a bigger set of fibers compared to the other. And it makes sense because when you go to this region where you're supposed to have a lot of fiber crossings, because you have the CST going up, you have the corpus callosum here going left, right, and you have other fibers going anterior, posterior, like the arcuate fasciculus, for example, you can't get them with DTI. DTI will just give you one orientation. It happens that the CST has maybe a higher anisotropy, so it will steer the main orientations towards the vertical one. And then you're going to get only one path, pretty much. If you get to CSD, you can see that you have the corpus callosum coming from this part here. You have the CST, or cortical spinal tract, going up here, and you can see these green lobes that are for the arcuate fasciculus. And then you can use some, I don't remember which strategy has been used for that one, if it was probabilistic or deterministic, but both would give you something a bit like this, so it doesn't really matter. But you get a wealth of fiber path that is like larger than DTI. Another way that you can look at this, if you try different strategies for tracking, is that you have this DTI plus deterministic tracking. DTI with probabilistic tracking, which seems to be a bit like thorough, a bit more thorough compared to the deterministic. And then you can do CSD plus probabilistic, and then you get all this wealth of band fans and stuff like this that can happen. So obviously it seems like CSD and probabilistic at least is beating DTI and deterministic all the time. Seems like that. Another meme, just to make you understand also what's the point here, why is it so important, is that usually you have people that try to investigate the structural connectors and they will use DTI, but they will forget that actually it's been estimated by Ben Uris and et al. That you have pretty much 70 to 90% of the brain that is made of fiber crossing, and then you will get bold trying to use DTI at investigating the connectome. So obviously you need to at least get this information of fiber crossing, and you would be surprised to learn that they are very, very few techniques that give access to fiber crossings in the brain. Whether it's models or signal representations or anything, you have very few of them that can handle a fiber crossing. And like the top of the modeling stuff is usually done on a single fiber level to some extent. It's very hard to get a crossing fiber. So there's a lot of work that can be done on this, definitely, yes. The problem with tractography is that it has a mountain of challenges. So for example, you can have this, what's called the bottleneck effect, where you have different fibers that will merge into one and then go their separate ways. So that can happen in different parts of the, for example, the corticospinal tract will have something like this, where you have a merging of fiber bundles, and then it's hard to remember which one goes where, just with diffusion information alone, orientation information alone, because orientation-wise, they fuse together is one track now, that's done. So it's hard to go back to it and see what you can do better than this. Wall effect is the same. It's like when you have different fibers kind of getting close to one another, and then you try to track, and sometimes the track will go like this and will connect to things that shouldn't be connected together. And it's very hard to tell the tractography algorithm, don't do that, because you don't know exactly when you're supposed to do it or not, just with orientation alone, because there's nothing differentiating these two bundles. You can have also some switch pathways that can happen with no good reason, just because at some point you use some probabilistic tracking, for example, and it chose to go that way, and then you're stuck that way to some extent. The tissue classifications here is also because sometimes it's hard to remember that you have fibers in the voxel when you have a lot of water in it. And one good example is this edema. When you have a brain tumor, it is usually surrounded by a lot of edema, which is a lot of fibers that is not completely free, but it's very free moving compared to actual axis. So it looks like a bit of a pool. And then these fibers may still exist in there, but it's very hard to detect them and to track with them, because you have so much water that is taking a lot of that signal out. And it's also difficult to just tease them apart. So this is one main problem of tractography. And when I was talking about these switching pathways, you have this thing that is called, for example, seeding in tractography, which is how many options per voxel you will give to start the tractography algorithm. So you could say, I'm going to start 10 times in that voxel in 10 different directions, kind of random, and see what comes out at the end, pretty much. But when you do that too much, you may find paths that don't exist at all. Like they have no point in being. It's just that you favored too much randomness at some point, and it went away. So you don't want to do this, and it's hard to put a threshold on how much to do it. So a lot of these problems exist. So in the end, that generated a few papers, quite recent. So this one is 2017. You have other ones in 2019 that are saying that tractography itself cannot handle all of the connectome as it is now, and will never be able to some extent, because we have some inherent limitations. And these inherent limitations come from the fact that usually tractography will be using some conventional diffusion encoding. So already there you restrict the amount of information that you have, and it also relies only on the orientation of the diffusion profile. And this orientation information alone is not discriminant enough so that you can tease apart different bundles if they are joining together or stuff like this. You should be able to realize that, for example, if you have two bundles with different T1s, I don't know, merging together, this merge still has two pools of fibers with different T1s. If you use different orientation information alone, you cannot do this because you have no T1 anywhere to be seen. So that's one of the key problems, and it's very challenging to implement these other metrics in the tractography. So that's a challenge again today.